But series has been going for half a century. How can we just add classics? Good question. So I said, welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. And those of you who raced in the Big Boat Series this last week know that for the first time ever, we had classic boats racing there. I was sailing on a boat built in 1928. Wonderful. Rolex loves it for a good reason. Who doesn't like more varnish, for heaven's sakes? Let's see, on the screen, Vince, could we put up the what's on my laptop, and we'll show people what speakers are upcoming. Here we go. So you'll see in December, we're going to hear from the naturalist Michael Ellis. We'll be hearing from a great author with great research. He's discovered that, in fact, there was a secret submarine fleet off of California during the beginning of World War II. And then, of course, in December, at the end of it, we'll have the father-son Christmas luncheon. In December, we'll listen to those of us who race sailboats all the time know that an incredible amount of energy is spent keeping the bottom really, really, really shiny clean. Well, we'll listen to a guy who does that stuff and much more to keep boats fast. Then Jim Shine will be here to talk about old California and San Francisco maps. And Dick Carter, the yacht designer who won the Fastnet race and was on the IOR rule committee that created the IOR rule. And you remember when in '64 rudders separated from keels with Intrepid? Well, he'll talk all about that early phase of yacht design. And in October, we have a very full October. At the end of October, we'll have the president of the new Treasure Island Museum here. Then we'll hear John Arndt, who's the publisher of Latitude 38, talk all about this little tiny magazine, which has this incredible worldwide credibility. John Ufisa will be here to talk all about his two books. And then we'll have another Anna Marie Schulte. She'll talk about Sparrowhawk. Sparrowhawk, as you may recall, was the nickname given the yacht, who knows, America, in 1851, which went from America over to the dominant power of the seas, Britain, and beat everybody racing around the Isle of Wight. And then Aaron will be here, Wegenheim, to talk all about the Delta Ditch Run. That's a one-way race, a specialized race. California and San Francisco Bay Area specifically have come up with several unique racing formats. This is a race where you just jibe 130 some odd times. I raced in it in this last week, and we counted 144 jibes all the way down from here to Stockton. And next week, if we love the Bay, and it's called the Bay Area for a reason, we are all united by this body of water between San Francisco and Oakland and Emeryville and Burlingame and Palo Alto, etc. That bay wouldn't be as clean were it not for the speaker next week. Michael Brodsky single-handedly took on huge lobbyists, incredible forces in Sacramento and, in fact, Washington, D.C. to kill the Quinn tunnels. Just applause for Michael Brodsky. Unbelievable feat. He'll be here to talk all about, that adventure. Now, a little bit about our speaker today. He picked up a camera for the first time at age 10. Back in those days, it was a Brownie black and white camera. By age 16, he and his buddy snuck into the Japanese Peace Conference in the San Francisco Opera House following Truman's motorcade, just went right in behind them, and using Boy Scout membership cards that were kind of blurred a little bit by the cellophane wrappings beside them, they flashed those and got in on what was a press pass. While there, they met with and interviewed multiple members of the delegates from different countries and had a personal interview with the Czechoslovakian representative, the Russian diplomats. Even though the San Francisco Chronicle couldn't get such interviews, our speaker today did those. All this dressed in white Levi's and jeans. A good uniform for Bill Gates, white jeans and white shirts, a good uniform half a century since. His fame kind of grew from this little episode, and pretty soon he found himself in 1958 going to Antarctica on a film expedition and filming, of all people, the Queen Mother for Great Britain, and meeting with Sir Edmund Hillary and taking his picture. And then pretty soon he found himself on the front cover, his photographs on the front cover of Life magazine, the National Geographic, in Germany, Stern magazine, Paris Review, etc. He's had such an incredible career. You can jump ahead to, I'm going to come back in a minute to the earlier days, but in 62, he wrote a book called San Francisco that was so powerful and valuable that the Chamber of Commerce literally handed it to visitors who would come to our city, and it was part of their welcoming kit. He thereafter wrote a similar book for Seattle, Vancouver area, and then the Miami area. And in 1966, Mort asked me, we've been buddies that long, he said, Ron, come on, I'm doing this movie, and we're coming over to Berkeley. We're going to shoot this frat house. There's this young actor named Dustin Hoffman, and we're shooting this little movie with a guy named Mike. Mike Nichols is the director. He's been a comedian. What does he know about directing a movie? And so I got to be on set for the filming of The Graduate, because our speaker today was the second unit director of The Graduate and other movies in that day. So real forward to today. So earlier this year, he agrees to go to China to do a National Geographic, to be part of a National Geographic expedition and shoot China. Now, if you've shot Seattle and San Francisco, you're ready for China. Please welcome my friend of many decades, great photographer, Morton Beebe.
Well, I'm a photographer, not an expert on China. First comment. And I must say that a little closer. Okay, how's that? I've had the good fortune ever since spending nearly a year in Antarctica back in 1957-58 of using that as a stimulus to try to catch an opportunity to travel with various entities on shooting assignments and have made it around the world about 3 times and have photographed in just about every continent on Earth. I've twice been to China, but this last trip was the longest and most thorough journey of the trip. There were 24 of us on this geographic expedition, and we started in Beijing. The morning newspaper, of course, back in May, obviously China raises the tariffs on U.S. in response. That would probably be the headline for the entire summer period. Notice the cafe latte, and along with this wonderful food. In our hotel room in Beijing, there were some great furnishings, including this dimensional piece representing old China. Outside was the, we were next to the consular and area, and it's amazing to see the fencing and the bars over the windows, sort of old China with air conditioning units on the outside. My wife and I were trying to find our way around that first day, and the interesting thing is you see a fellow with a cell phone here. They use the cell phone now as a means of communication, an immediate translator. He would hold it up and say, what are you saying in Chinese? And we answered back by just speaking into the cell phone. And we had a very fast and efficient conversation, given directions. We made it to, as everybody does, to Tiananmen Square, and the huge monument to Chairman Mao. The lines of people from every nation, particularly China, were lined up to see the tomb of Mao, including the Tibetans. And a little warrior. This is the heading towards the Forbidden City. It's a healthy hike. as we crossed the areas and into the incredible buildings. There were women dressed in the ancient, beautiful outfits from the days of the concubines and the emperor. We did, yeah. Mostly by virtue of a nod. Everybody was very accommodating in terms of photography. We never had anybody short of a guard in front of a building say, please turn your camera away. Architecture is breathtaking. Here, not only for Chinese, but anybody that has kids, you can dress them up as emperor and members of the royal family. In the Forbidden City, there are some 900 buildings and temples. This is the Palace Museum. And then we exited the Tiananmen Square area and everybody got into a rickshaw. And we went through a what's called a hutong, which is an ancient village of narrow streets, only generally accessible by one-way riding in these beautiful carriages, and shops along the way. I'm not sure what she was selling with her V. This is called the Temple of Heaven. Then we drove, or rather traveled by train, and headed to an extended area up in the mountainside with the Great Wall. I had no idea how many of these structures exist over thousands of miles across the top of China. But some are accessible and you can walk and tour up and down the structures that are thousands of years old. Another highlight of the early part of the trip is to the Terracotta Museum. This is composed of 1,000 soldiers, chariots, and horses, which were buried around 210 BC. And the tomb, in front of the tomb of the first Chinese emperor, Qi Shi Huang. Even the perfect shape of the horses. Every single one of these figures was a representation of an actual soldier. You can see the color in the materials which remain. And then this was an illustration of their means of transport. Here's a head of, or three heads of different warriors. And the color is incredible that it still remains. I love this one because in this photograph I see two Chinese who somewhat resemble the warrior who's standing apparently with a sword or spear. Just this, the hands. Apparently they had square-shaped shoes. I don't know what. And they had a metal, almost like future European warriors with metal vests. And the artillery at the time was bow and arrow. It was amazing to see this as a perfect example of what it would have looked like, and a single carriage with its 4 horses. Leaving that area, which was unbelievable, it was like visiting a football field, and as far as you could see in all directions, with thousands of these terracotta figures. We then exited from one area to another. I couldn't tell you whether this is lemon meringue pie. I didn't sample, but it looks like it might be sort of a pineapple piece. And then here's various fruits and all. This is octopus on a stick. Then we entered in this particular day, we entered the Muslim quarters. The detail and the structure of thousands of years are quite beautiful. There's a Muslim cleric, and then the ladies dressed like well, they're tourists in their own religious area. We ate well everywhere we went. I couldn't tell you what everything there is on the table, but the quantity of food that was served at lunch and dinner was unbelievable. Every morning in each of the hotels we stayed, there was an enormous buffet about the size of this entire room and lobby. This is with a hot, where you take your meat dish and cook it as you please. This Szechuan pot. In order to lose a little weight maybe in the evening after heavy dining on the streets of the community, they have these like a pull-up exercise and running. Here on top of one of the walls surrounding our next community were wedding pictures being taken, and this cute little girl dressed in a sort of a Shirley Temple or Wizard of Oz outfit, by contrast to the traditional ancient Chinese. We then flew from one area, having traveled to the walled city areas, to the Three Gorges, which is the largest dam and water project in the world. It's hard to guess the immensity of this, but it's where your river systems cross and major shipping. Traveling by boat. The cell phones were used by everybody. No matter where you went, everybody had a cell phone. This is on the deck at night of these vessels that we set off with. They're about 5 stories tall with a beautiful bar and inside music. This is another vessel passing us heading down the Yangtze. Illustrations, tempting us for the fact that we were soon to visit the panda farm. One thing noted were these bridges, not unlike the shape of the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge with the towers and cable supports. Here along the waterways and the steep hillsides, you can see, well, I won't use that. Those are coffins in the caves, ancient coffins. And then where you see a cut in the water line are passageways in the rocks for the ancient way of traveling over the countryside. What changed at the moment with the sea level or level of the river system up 10 feet or more are these bridges that you keep running into where they now allow people to transit back and forth between communities. At one point, we boarded a small vessel that took us upstream to visit some villages. In the past, these guys were naked hauling the boats up, called boat trackers. Here, this takes 2 to move these sand pans. We stopped at a small village on a hillside, beautifully maintained. Quite artistic the way they wrapped the ropes, stacked the wood, and build these fronts. This was the entrance to the house with Chairman Mao's painting on the interior. Then heading back again down the Yangtze, we were in with these incredibly high mountains and ran into some weather here and there. One of our companions was a family, Chinese family, that shared the perspective of New China, Old China. This woman was both the doctor on board the vessel, but she also gave Tai Chi lessons in the morning as a demonstration. Another was doing the usual tea ceremony. Here in the market, fresh ducks available. I've seen a few shops, even here in San Francisco, with the head still on the duck or chicken. And then these bridges with the red exterior. On board the vessel that we were transiting down the Yangtze, the crew welcomed us in costume and music. This was one of the 2 guides that were with us. This young fellow spoke perfect English. This is a menu. It may be a little hard to see here in this size, but this was so-called Taste of China Farewell Dinner. And it was king pao chicken, roasted lamb chop, crispy fried dory fish, steamed meatballs, boiled shredded dry bean, and onward. How one could consume all of that, you'd certainly need a doggy bag. Then this is another temple area. A lot of security along the way. In most of these areas, you went through a security check either by fingerprint or photograph. And this is the area of statuary. This is card-playing ladies in the park. This was another area of the Muslim side of the entity. And now by contrast, we're in Shing area with McDonald's hamburgers on the lowest floor. And these ladies in unison were dancing in the outskirts and the sidewalks as an evening exercise. And apparently the same group or other groups met every night about 6 to 7 in the evening with music and would dance in uniform. If not, they came and went on bicycle. It's one of the few signs of old China, as I remember visiting about 15 years ago, was, purveyors carrying things around on the back of a bicycle. Well, this begins the visit to the Panda farm. We were encouraged to make these little doughy items for the giant panda. And if we wanted to, we could help clean the cage. They certainly can hold your attention. They sit there eating bamboo all day long. A brief rest. It's my wife having just offered the panda that little cake that we just made. Then our own dining experience again. With light entertainment and costume. A favorite area that I'd always wanted to visit that prompted me into this trip was to visit Guilin, which is an area where these incredible karst mountains jut out of the landscape. And they're really magnificent. I'm sure you've seen the familiar painting with somebody fishing or going up and downstream in China. Here, Danielle and myself on board the vessel as we look out on a rather modern home there along the edge of the water, and a fisherman with his two cormorants, yes. Here's a fellow with a line who managed to climb the rocks on the edges. And here's the cormorants and the fisherman. Love the art of the umbrella. And photographing with light equipment, I have to admit that I prefer to use my cell phone than carting around cameras that I've carried 2 or 3 at a time in the past. And the only shortcoming is that you're not getting much of a telephoto out of a camera phone. But they're truly amazing as far as detail, sharpness, and working in low light conditions. It's wonderful to reach in your pocket and be able to grab a shot such as with these 5 kids. We ran into a monsoon in one community. Everybody out with their umbrella. Phenomenal stores. Again, we managed to not speak English with somebody, but we would use our cell phone to ask questions and price and or purchase. There again, the incredibly beautiful mountainsides. This is heading toward Shanghai, where the traffic is a mix of scooters, bikes, and pedestrians. This was a representation on the side of a building of what those karst mountain peaks look like. And the incredible height of some buildings, 30, 40, 50, 100-story tall. This is in the midst of the business area of Shanghai. And I'm shooting into a curved ball or sphere to try to capture as many buildings as surrounding us. The Shanghai Tower, which we went up in, is 120 stories tall. And the architect for it is Art Gensler of San Francisco. I've heard Art describe some of the efforts that he put into it. You get into an elevator in that building. This is a neighboring building when you get up in that tower. It's the second highest building in the world. The elevator gets you from floor 1 to the top in 55 seconds. And yet you don't, end up as you do, say, in New York, going up the Empire State Building, and you almost get a headache by the time you get to the top. One of the views from that 120 stories up, it looks on a neighboring building that looks like a bottle opener by its shape. And it's interesting, these buildings are both office, residential, and shopping. So you've got different levels of commerce. A favorite spot that we had our last day in China was the Fairmont Hotel, where they have the old jazz band in the Peace Hotel. And this was like being in the 20s. They all Chinese playing great music. Everybody's out dancing and dressing up in straw hats and uniforms. I think we spent 3 nights listening to the music and having a great time. The exterior of the building is in that modern sense Gensler did with the tower, but this is the top floor of the Fairmont. And the interior is beautiful. Incredible ceilings. Still, on side streets, you can still see everybody hanging their clothes out to dry, and small, not unlike Chinatown, San Francisco. But in the main, everywhere we went in China, traveling both by high-speed rail. They now have a train that you can travel at about 500 miles an hour out to the airport. There are some communities where they've retained the architecture and improved on it. Here again is McDonald's right in the middle of it all. Faces of the 20s. Snake or serpent wall. Here again is the Shanghai Tower. Apparently the tower accumulates enough water that that they have it like a giant cistern inside. Next to it is the fantastic Museum of Art. Here at night from the surrounding area, you look back at life from the rooftops and restaurants. Well, I think I'm right on time, Ron.
Wonderful work.
Thank you.
Bring your mic with you, buddy.
Bring this. Oh,
You have a seat. I'll get your mic too. Go ahead.
right or left?
Right over there. Here you go, buddy.
Thank you.
So I have great pleasure in introducing everyone or welcoming everybody to this Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, where we feature a dear friend of more than half a century, Morton Beebe. As you can see, Mort is a great photographer. We just got a tour of China, half-an-hour tour of the biggest country on the planet. It's fun for me to ask a dear friend of all these years lots of questions. So Mort, you have been shooting with your camera all around the world for more than half a century. Talk to me about a favorite photo assignment over this half century.
Well, I had the good fortune of when I was in the Navy, coming out of flight school, to be offered, where would you like to be located and fly? And I said, well, I wanted to say Hawaii. Instead, I said South Pacific. Somehow that was interpreted and ended up on assignment in Antarctica, where I spent more than a year and 2 years in between Pentagon and the ice of Antarctica. But it was an experience never to be forgotten.
So when you were in China just now, could you interview people, everyday people on the street?
Well, interviewed by using your cell phone, yes.
Mm-hmm.
We asked questions and I'd say maybe 5 or 10% of the people could answer back in English.
So what year was the first year you ever visited China?
Good question. I traveled with a group on a round the world trip where we were meeting with heads of state. And these were young kids, 10 to 20, who had written essays on banning the atomic bomb. And it was called Children as the Peacemakers, and we ended up in Tiananmen Square meeting with officials.
What year was that?
That's about 30 years back.
Mm-hmm. So give us in a couple sentences, what's just flash different from 30 years of change in China? What's different now?
Well, the first thing I noticed, everybody in those early days was riding a bicycle and carrying huge loads of baskets and
Those days.
everything in the early days. Now bicycles are as prevalent as you find them along the Embarcadero in San Francisco, or more so. And I don't know how in that huge pile of bikes you can find your own. I didn't see anybody pedaling on the scooters as you find here in the Bay Area. But as far as automobiles, they're everywhere. And the standard of living is incredible. No matter where you were in China, from Beijing to Shanghai and all the communities in between, there were great signs of prosperity everywhere.
So in 1950, you kind of hid a little bit behind your 4x5 speed graphic to act like a member of the press and to sneak into the peace talks in San Francisco following President Truman's motorcade. Nowadays, what do you use to take pictures?
Well, modestly, I'd say that I use my cell phone, the iPhone. The quality of the image on a cell phone, in your latter models, is magnificent. And I'm able to blow images up to, 20 or 30 inches. If I'm going to be doing an entire exhibit of work, I'd be better off using a Leica or Nikon or a Minolta or whatever it be. But certainly for general purposes, the cell phone is magnificent because it's both live action. You shoot your video and you can pull a frame or two out of the video and add it to your still collection. You can shoot in quantities of images, not firing off like, rapid fire, but you can shoot in such a manner that you don't run out of film. I mean, in the days of 35 millimeter and the wonderful days of Kodachrome, which was the most beautiful film available, you were always either initially at 12, then 24, and then finally 36 exposure. But you had to pause, change film, and I always had the risk of having the film damaged while you went through the checkpoint at the airport. I've had many a battle trying to get your film, out of the camera bag into the X-ray, and did have a large quantity of film destroyed.
Great. So now I'm going to keep asking questions until I see those in the audience, and one is showing up now. Paul Kamen, naval architect, has a question. Paul.
Well, you might have answered my question. It's kind of a time capsule question. Kodachrome or Ektachrome, and why?
Well, Kodachrome, I don't think there's ever been a film in the past or in the future. It's really like a black and white film that it was just magnificent in the color and of it.
Oh, I was always an Ektachrome partisan.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, Ektachrome is fine, but it has a tendency to bleach out. I've got Kodachrome that I shot back in the 50s that are as good in color as they were at the time I shot them. With most of my Ektachrome, has faded to blue. So the stability isn't there with the latter film.
But it was a stability issue more than a color value issue.
Yeah.
So Mort, you've worked with some amazing collaborators. Tell us, when did you meet Ansel Adams? Talk a little bit about working with Ansel back in the day.
Yeah, Ansel was a wonderful host. He was a part of a group known as ASMP, American Society of Magazine Photographers. And we had meetings down in Carmel or at his home in the early days with people like Dorothea Lange and Imogene Cunningham present. It was a great mix of both men and women photographers. Now I'm glad to see more women back into the photography business than it was when I was doing so much shooting. The Ansel was highly respected, and I, like everybody, collected a few of his books. But I had one instance where an elderly gentleman that were friends of my parents called me and said, would I come to their place for dinner, because they had found a box of prints under a bed in the fellow's bedroom, and he said, it's just in an old Kodak box and there's some prints of Ansel. So I went over to their retirement home in the East Bay, and they had some over 30 11 by 14 prints and Ansel had done when he used the name of Ansel Easton Adams, his middle name, and must have been shot in his, not his teen years, but in his early 20s. And this fellow knew Ansel because he was the publisher's representative for a number of magazines, and the people in Yosemite had encouraged Ansel to make friends with this fellow, and had gone on a couple of camping trips together. So these were beautiful images, most of them. So I took them under consignment for him and managed to reach Sotheby's. And by the time we handled negotiations and they went up for auction, they sold for more than $500,000.
Out from under the bed.
Yeah, they were under the bed.
Okay, Jim Hancock has a question. Jim.
I'm supposed to ask a short question. Did you know Harold Edgerton, Doc Edgerton, and did you ever get involved in doing any high-speed photography?
I certainly knew of his work. And was he here in the Bay Area? Yeah, back east. I certainly know everything from bullet passing through whatever, and studies of motion that exceeded anything that you could generally capture on film.
So you were second unit director on multiple movies. What was it like working with Woody Allen?
Woody's just as he appears in film. He very bright, but very, sort of shy and casual. I mean, every night after we'd do a shoot, we'd end up somewhere in North Beach in a sort of family restaurant, and everybody gathered around the table sipping wine and spaghetti. He would end it by having us all look at the previous day's daily shots, and he would count the laughs to see if there were enough humor. Otherwise, let's start over again. And he'd go home at night. He was living over in Belvedere, and rewrite the scripts. But that's on the Take the Money and Run project. He came here 3 different times, and I must say my favorite was that profile and Hemingway and everybody. I can't even think of the name of it. I wasn't involved in that one, but Take the Money and Run was actually shot over there where the Moscone Center is, where old buildings and apartments.
So now you were responsible for another major innovation in photography. You created the image bank, if I recall the name of it. And that was in like 79, 80. When was that?
Yeah.
And nowadays people are familiar with Getty Images and Magnum and so on. How many images did you have in the original predecessor to all of these image banks? How many were in your image bank back in the early 80s?
Well, I still have about 400,000 transparencies. They're all sleeved. They're all captioned on the mounts.
400,000.
Yes.
How many pictures do you think you've taken?
Oh,
I know it's
wouldn't have
give
any
us-
idea.
but in a given year, how many do you think you take?
Just into the thousands. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think any of us would be counting. It'd be like saying how many frames have you shot on a cell phone of images. The main thing is being a good editor and selecting material that's worthy of showing others or keeping for your own records.
If we had a frequent flyer file, our next questioner would be at the top, almost at the very top of the list. Mrs. Palmer has a question. Jean, what's your question, my dear?
Do you develop as you go along on a trip, or have a professional get them later? Now, you're a professional anyway.
Yeah. Well, we didn't. That's another problem in the days of film. Is it's one thing to have your film unexposed by radiation or something getting to the location, but it's another thing to be in Africa or somewhere and wondering if you got the shot that you were going after. And then there are very few places that you could get film processed immediately in order to, particularly color, in order to say, I've got it, I don't have to remain here any longer. The only precaution you could take in those days was to overshoot. Use 2 cameras, 2 sets of film, and then carry them, some of them in your socks and the other in some other protected manner. Remember the lead bags and all we had at one point. And now everything is on the cell phone, in the cloud. So you've got two ways. If you drop your phone into the San Francisco Bay, you still know that the cloud has a perfect copy of everything you wanted, plus everything that backed it up. So life is easier.
So years ago, you spent time in the darkroom
Indeed.
and you developed your own photos. Are you using Photoshop now? How do you get the refinements you want post-production?
Well, Photoshop and Adobe both have wonderful but corrective elements. But notice even on your cell phone these days, you can make great corrections and immediately to see if you'd like something a little darker, the contrast level a little greater, a shift of color. That's done without having to go into your computer and managing to spend the time or the hours of change.
So what's bad about cell phone photography?
Bad? Well, I think the main thing is that bad at everybody, in any environment wants to have that cell phone handy and all. And I know in many cases, privacy is a factor. Like here, even at lunch today, I don't see people out there with the cell phones popping everywhere. And there are many clubs and places that say, put the cell phones away. But that's more of being interrupted by somebody making a call. But it's also the concern of people taking pictures and embarrassing somebody who didn't show up with his wife or didn't want his mistress to be identified. So anyway, that's
Be careful, everybody. So what's the line on when you ask permission and don't ask permission? You're a photographer. For half a century, you've shot famous people, regular people, public people. Where's the line? When do you ask? When do you not ask these days?
Well, it's a good idea to ask. I mean, just out of politeness. And of course, that can be a problem if you're in a situation where something is going to change any minute. I mean, you think of Cartier-Bresson asking half a dozen people quickly, do you mind that going back and jumping over the wall or whatever it is? It's hard to recreate a scene. It's better to get a shot than say, may I share an image that I like with you? Or find a parent who will give an okay because the person is not isn't over 21. And then just simply be very cautious about who and where you allow something to be published. I know there have been lawsuits based on pictures in New York Times, Sunday Magazine, and somebody's embarrassed because of the neighborhood they were walking in or the person they were seemingly next to. So between you and your editor.
Question in the back of the room. Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Larry Cushing. This is a question that doesn't really relate to photography, but to your general trip to China. What is your impression of the general population's impact on coexisting with the other parts of the world?
Well, the population of China is 3 times that of the United States, and you readily recognize it. But I think in terms of attitude, China's always been used to having an emperor or some figurehead rule, set down dictatorial policy. Whereas in this country, we're used to a pretty good form of free expression. As far as, I think the biggest problem is climate change at the moment. Are the many nations, including the U.S., willing to cut back and We had a lot of smog in Beijing, and they have made great inroads in that regard. Fortunately, the smog was quite high, but it darkened the skies. It was like San Francisco in the middle of winter. But yet, when we finally got into the open landscape, you could begin to see the blue and the color of nature and the better lighting on buildings and people. But we didn't wear a face mask.
So, Mort, we're going to end with a lightning round. Tell me the first word that comes to mind, the very first word when I say Antarctica.
South Pole.
China. First word.
First word, magnificent.
Africa.
Wow. A challenge. Exotic.
New Zealand.
Beautiful landscape.
Vancouver.
Vancouver? Oh, great waterways.
Miami.
Mountains. Miami is
One word. First word.
nightlife.
San Francisco.
Wonderful place to live.
Shanghai.
Exuberant.
Moscow.
Moscow.
Washington, D.C.
It's a great landscape and museums and
New York City.
oh, New York is fun at any hour. Can work out.
People now. Queen Mother.
Well, the Queen Mother that I met has passed, but she was generous.
Sir Edmund Hillary.
Hillary was a rather quiet, modest individual, and truly a great New Zealander.
Woody Allen.
He's fun to be around.
Mike Nichols.
Sorry to his loss. Inventive.
Dustin Hoffman.
Oh, he was wild. He got after me because I put him in the same hotel that all the staff were in. He wanted his own privacy.
So we have enjoyed visiting with an icon himself, one of the greatest photographers alive, and has had an amazing history, more than a half century of shooting, big magazine covers, and you're right here in San Francisco, as humble as possible. So thank you very much, Morton Beebe, for joining us at the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon at St. Francis Yacht Club. And with that, the luncheon is adjourned. Thank you.
Can I give you the mic?